Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome. Welcome to the Bali. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm going to host this event tonight. And also a warm welcome to the millions of viewers who are watching online right now. Great to have you also here. I will moderate this event, and we're going to talk, of course, about the war in Ukraine, but also a bit more fundamental, the relations between NATO, EU, Russia, and also look at the bigger question: how do we deal with Russia? What can we learn from the past, and what are going to be the steps we need to take or can take? And also maybe, because we don't have politicians, but experts, what do we expect is going to happen in the coming weeks and months? And well, I have an esteemed panel of speakers with me. We're really happy that they're here. There's one cancellation, unfortunately, because of a last-minute flu. That is Christian Mark Livlander, head cyber and hybrid policy at NATO. So that's a shame, but yeah, he was caught with the flu last minute. But we are very happy with our other panelists, of course. We're going to talk to Kisia Hekster. She's the NATO and EU correspondent and previous Russia correspondent from 2008 to 2011. 12. That's why I was looking at you, because I was doubting when I was saying it. She also wrote a book, The Putin Show, about her years in Russia. Actually, it's the first interview I've ever done with you. So that's also nice to have that book here again. We're going to talk to Frans Osinga. He is professor, special chair in war studies at Leiden University, and also a previous Air Commodore. Still, for those who maybe do not know what that is, what's an Air Commodore?
It's just a general officer.
A general officer.
1-star of a general.
Well, oh, it's you're going.
You can go to 4-star. I just got one.
And why was that?
Well, I became a professor.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's a good reason, I would say. Maybe you should talk a bit more close to the mic. Yeah. And also we're going to talk to, all the way from Finland, you just arrived this morning, Jacob Kalensky. He's a senior analyst at the European Center of Excellence for countering hybrid threats, and he knows everything about disinformation and Russia. Knows all about it. You're going to know everything. We will speak for a bit longer than an hour, and after that there's going to be room for questions from the audience, so bear with me. But first, I think we also need to address what has been happening yesterday. So let's first watch a small clip about, which shows Putin's speech yesterday.
В ход пошел и ядерный шантаж. Речь идет не только о поощряемых Западом обстрелах Запорожской атомной электростанции, что грозит атомной катастрофой, но и о высказываниях некоторых высокопоставленных представителей ведущих государств НАТО о возможности и допустимости применения против России оружия массового поражения, ядерного оружия. Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф. А те, кто пытаются шантажировать нас ядерным оружием, должны знать, что роза ветров может развернуться.
Yes. So Frans Osinga, specialized in war studies. We're now, yesterday you also talked about the speech, but now a day after, what's your most important takeaway at where we are right now? Because people are saying this is a turning point again.
It is a political turning point in the sense that dragging us into the nuclear doctrine, as he did yesterday, happens in a context that differs markedly from the moment he did in the first time, that's in February, March. In those days, he didn't need it. He was winning on the battlefield, or so it seemed. And he used it a bit lightheartedly. Medvedev did the same. These days, when he uses this threat, and I'll move into the nature of the threat, the seriousness, he communicates the threat in a context where he's actually losing, where he's in a tight spot. Last week we saw that he was actually under pressure by China, India. The day before yesterday, Erdogan actually said, you need to withdraw from Ukraine and stop the war. He's losing on the battlefield. He's about to lose even territory that he had before February 24th. So communicating a threat like this yesterday has a different connotation, has a different value.
It comes from weakness, you say?
It comes from weakness. He is responding to pressure, also from the extreme nationalists, whom in the past 3 months, because of the setbacks on the battlefield, have actually stated, and I quote, don't get me wrong, I quote, "Are we masturbating or are we waging war?" Forcing Putin to really take this seriously and go beyond this label of a special operation and start mobilizing and escalating. So he's addressing that flank.
Yeah.
But he also needs to be careful about his own population. He's losing the population, I think it's going to be a topic later on. But that explains why he did it yesterday, a bit to the surprise of many. We had expected that he would have done this after the referendum, when he would have hypothetically redrawn the borders in Europe, where he could create this credible narrative that it was now all about protecting the Russian borders.
And legitimized by this referendum.
Exactly, legitimized the escalation, the mobilization. Now, if you allow me, the Russian nuclear doctrine looks different compared to ours. For them, there is no concept such as deterrence as we know. We have nuclear weapons to deter aggression. For them, nuclear weapons can be used to what we think is deterrence, prevent something from happening, or use it to compel something to happen. You can use it to establish a status quo, and the use of nuclear weapons can be used when Russia itself is being threatened, the regime is being threatened, when nuclear weapons are being threatened. But it doesn't necessarily need to move into an all-out nuclear war. For them, there's also this continuum, and he refers to that in his speech, from conventional weapons, long-range conventional missiles, then all of a sudden move into the small tactical nuclear weapons. And from that you may actually regress back to conventional weapons. So they don't necessarily make the categorical distinction that we do until they get to the strategic nuclear weapons, the ones we recognize as political deterrence. So what he said there, listen, I'm not going to use nuclear weapons right away. That's not the issue. But I'm warning you, you are getting closer to the red line. I may escalate with conventional weapons, targeting all sorts of infrastructure. Kiev, for instance, the government buildings are still standing. Very remarkable. So he might escalate with conventional weapons, and at some point even start using nuclear weapons. We haven't reached that point yet. Sorry. Okay, you want me to stop?
Well, we have 1 hour to dissect all these kinds of analysis you are making. Because Kiesje Hekster, at the same time, while this is all already geopolitical, I think you've explained this quite nicely already, what's the tactic behind it and what's maybe different from how we perceive it in the West. It's also a reality that a speech like that has impact on the ground, on people also who live in Russia. And I think that's something which also is unique in the aftermath of the speech yesterday, the response in Russia. What is it that you have heard or seen or noticed?
I guess for the first time in over 6, almost 7 months, the war has really come to Russia itself. There is no escape now anymore. Everybody who could still pretend that there was not a war going on could still pretend that life was business as usual. People were going out in the restaurants, going to the movies, and that this was something that was not their business. Now, suddenly, by stroke of lightning, I would say, are confronted with this war. And this was, of course, especially the reason why Putin didn't want to call for this mobilization. I was going into my memory, I was reading in March, he was categorically denying that this would ever take place. Now we're a few months later and he has to take this step. So of course it's a sign of weakness, it's very clear. And I was going through this speech yesterday, and of course everybody was saying it's about 300,000 men. This is what Putin was putting the emphasis on, that it was a partial mobilization. But journalists from Russia and also other people have been quick to remark that if you look at the Okaz that was taken out, that there's actually not such a number in there, that it can be up to 1 million. It can be up to 2 million, because this is the amount that of number of people in Russia that are on the reserve. So it's not about Ukrainians who are dying. It's about people's children. It's about husbands being sent away. And already today we've seen the first clips coming out of Moscow, of Moscow, but also in the Far East, of people being drafted, and this was, of course, very difficult for people to send their fathers, their sons, their husbands off to war. Yesterday there was some demonstrations throughout the country where thousands of people took place. That was quite remarkable because we all know that if you go out into the streets, you can get a 15 years prison sentence, and people still wanted to get out.
Well, I even heard that the people who were being arrested already were drafted for...
Yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Yeah. So as a result, they got a draft notice to sign. Yeah. And I talked also to some of my friends, and I was also quite impressed or sad. Actually, it was very sad to hear that from one of my friends, her husband is also probably going to be drafted. They don't know if he's going to be drafted because it's not clear at what age it will stop or not. But they were in complete shock. And these are people, of course, who are not, they don't want to fight in this war, but more important, they don't support Putin at all. Yeah. And I think already today, we'll come into this later as well, we've seen that there is quite a big discussion in how to react to Russians wanting to leave the country, because of course we've seen these pictures as well immediately. Yeah,
because Jacob, you live in Finland, you work in Finland. You've already seen many Russians, I think, going to Finland. We've seen the images today, trying to flee Russia. And at the same time, what we're talking about, what they are talking about, plays into your expertise already, because we're trying to assess what has been said yesterday, and at the same time that we're assessing it, it seems like the goalposts are moving. First, it's a partial mobilization, but immediately, a few hours later, that is being debunked as actually, well, the drafting is bigger than that. So how do you assess what has happened yesterday? Because there's been, well, the rhetoric has meaning and also affects immediately.
Thanks for the question. Before I answer, am I actually the only person in the room because of whom you have to speak English?
Well...
Okay, sorry about that.
I was thinking you were proposing to then do it in Dutch, but I think that's not handy for you.
So, apologies for forcing you to listen to a different language. I actually didn't see the speech because I was on a plane from Helsinki to Prague. Yesterday I had an event in Prague, so thank you for showing me that bit of it. But obviously I read a piece about it. But that lovely part about the nuclear threat, and actually the West is threatening us with a nuclear threat. It reminded me of Ion Mihai Pacepa, the Romanian defector from the Communist Secret Service of Romania, Securitas. And he described this three-level information approach that the KGB developed for situations like this. In the first level, we didn't do nothing wrong. Second level, if we did something wrong, it didn't have any impact. And third level, look at the Americans, they are doing the same. And then rinse and repeat. And you will always find someone who will be hooked by one of these positions. And they have been threatening with nukes, I believe, at least since 2008 war in Georgia. It was them threatening to nuke Romania and Poland if they get the US missile systems. Yet they have the audacity to actually accuse the West of threatening with the weapons to them. I might differ a little bit from France about how seriously I evaluate it, precisely because we have seen it so many times. It seems to me that the desired impact is mainly informational rather than nuclear. On the other hand, I perfectly understand the point of view. We shouldn't underestimate it precisely because of the gravity of the threat. So we definitely should take it seriously. And we've seen many times that the Kremlin is willing to cross many boundaries that we thought were unthinkable. Many people didn't believe that he will go to Crimea. Many people didn't believe that he will start a full-scale invasion. Many people wouldn't believe the atrocities he was committing in Syria. I think he mainly needs to justify to the Russians why they are going to suffer some more for some longer time, precisely their husbands and sons leaving. On the other hand, I have to admit that I am slightly merciless in this regard towards the Russians, because This is the situation that Ukrainians live in for the past 8 years. Everybody I know, every of my friends has someone on the front line. They have a husband or son or brother who was killed or injured. So I don't really like feel pity for them. I do hope that the mobilization is a good sign for Ukraine in the sense that it shows that they are really desperate and they are doing things, doing steps that they didn't want to do. So they feel committed to do something they didn't want to do. I hope that's.
So in that sense, you hope it's a sort of renewed morale for Ukrainians to see this is what is happening. So we're doing the right thing.
I talked to some Ukrainians as well, and this is exactly how they view it. Of course, this is a sign that they are doing a good job. That this is necessary because this is absolutely something Putin wanted to avoid. Yeah.
At the same time, we're having this discussion in the context that, to paraphrase a great series, winter is coming. We're also in the Netherlands, in the whole Europe, facing inflation. And also the analysis I heard was that the partial mobilization is also a way to be able to make it through the winter with the offensive of Russia. Is this also, with the speech yesterday, a test for the unity of Europe, how to respond to this? Because we can agree on how this is being interpreted, but at the same time you already hear European leaders assessing it also differently. So how do you watch the unity of Europe in that sense? And then also to France, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's from the beginning it's been a constant debate, of course, within the European Union, how to prolong this unity. If you look from it, I mean, you can look to it from all different kind of perspectives. I think from the main important thing to say is that, of course, it's quite impressive how this unity for so long is taking and holding, and this is like a mantra in Brussels, and I think all over the world, that we are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes, with whatever it takes. And so this is one way of looking at this. Of course, within the Union, there is quite a different perspective of how to deal with Russia in the beginning, especially how to deal with negotiations, yes, no. You see a lot of difference between Eastern European countries and the more Western countries. We will definitely come to talk to that about a bit more in detail, I guess. So even today, I think Orban gave an interview to Bloomberg saying that he wanted to get rid of all Russian sanctions. And in that perspective, I think there's a lot of interesting elections also coming up. We had one in Sweden, we will have one in Italy, which will be quite interesting to watch how this will work out, because we know that some of the probably one of the coalition partners that is going to form the government is quite pro-Putin. So this will give extra weight to the Hungarian side of the...
And also put a strain on European unity.
Absolutely, So, I think it's a bit, maybe we have to wait a little bit longer to see how long this will last.
Yeah. Because then we say it's a new chapter. You've described that in how Russia is dealing with the war and the invasion. Is it also? Do you also perceive it as a new chapter for Europe and the EU in how to deal with Russia?
In a sense, it is a very tense period, because it was remarkable how Putin has managed to unify Europe in February, March, how quickly we imposed a very stringent sanction package. And indeed, just last week, we decided for the 8th sanction package. That has been remarkable. We've seen European Union wavering in June, July, when the offensive by Russia in the Donbass seemed to be going well. We saw the French elections taking place, where Macron only had a very small majority over Marine Le Pen. So his hands were tied.
Do you connect that to what has been going on in Ukraine?
In the sense that it tied his hands somewhat. And that was the time when he said, we got to be careful not to humiliate Putin. Scholz said the same. And it is remarkable now that this Russian offensive has died down in August, and we saw the counter-offensive first in the Crimea with long-range missiles, and then in Kharkov, that we see Macron and Scholz really making forceful statements. Just 2 days ago in the UN, Scholz said, listen, you really got to stop this war, and you really got to leave Ukraine. The first forceful statement like that in the past couple of months. So in that sense, European Union, until yesterday, was pretty strong, really strong. And the signal that Putin now sends tries to actually drive a wedge in European Union. And what you refer to, Orban, indeed, is the first one who is probably going to use the risk of escalation as a fig leaf, as an excuse to say, listen, we got to stop this package of sanctions. Italy is also one of those countries that might topple Union. The interesting thing is, in Europe, the balance of weight moves to Eastern Europe, and I think Union there is pretty strong. Biden is pretty strong, has shown great leadership, has really moved Europe forward in terms of willingness to deploy weaponry, sophisticated weapons. Truss and Wallace, right, the Minister of Defense in the UK, and Truss, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, now the Prime Minister, are very forceful voices in there. So Union is still strong, but the signal that Putin wants to send to Europe, the intent of that is to try to drive a wedge. And it might be successful. Prior to February 24th, we were self-deterred. We used the excuse that Ukraine was not a NATO member. We were energy dependent, and oh, by the way, Russia had nuclear weapons. So let's not escalate. So we deterred ourselves. We gave a gift to Putin that he even didn't ask for. That was that context. So in his opinion, perhaps the perception is there that threatening with nuclear escalation might actually do the trick once again.
But I think if we talk about giving a gift to Europe, one of the things, maybe it's a good time to watch that speech also, because von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, in her State of the European Union, said something quite interesting about the gift to Putin. Let's listen to that.
One lesson from this war is we should have listened to those who know Putin, to Anna Politkovskaya and all the Russian journalists who exposed the crimes and paid the ultimate price, to our friends in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the opposition in Belarus. We should have listened to the voices inside our union, in Poland, in the Baltics, and all across Central and Eastern Europe. They have been telling us for years that Putin would not stop, and they acted accordingly.
Yeah, well, if we lay the groundwork a bit more and go back in time, I saw you nodding quite fiercely yes to her words. But you've been working within the EU for many years, and you've actually been trying to get this message maybe also across for quite a few years in your own respective domain.
Oh, yes, I have. And yeah, I can only underline those words that they didn't listen. No.
Yeah. And how do you assess then, maybe lastly, before we go back to 10 years ago, what has been happening now? Because Frans said the speech is also trying to drive a wedge again. Orban is one of those pushing the wedge already. So maybe the time element also brings back old habits in Europe that has been going on for the past, well, how many years already? How do you assess that? Are we on the brink of going back into old habits with how we deal with Russia, or is there a rupture?
I don't know. On one hand, I'm positively surprised actually by the unity Frans was talking about. However, I also see the risks, and apart from the countries you both mentioned, I would probably also highlight Czech Republic, where we had 70,000 people protesting against the government, against the sanctions against Russia, calling actually for a more pro-Kremlin policy. Our neighboring Slovakia, there are 30% of people who believe that it's actually the West to blame for the war in Ukraine, not the country that amassed dozens of thousands of soldiers in the country and is murdering people on a daily basis. So there are quite a few countries where we might have a problem, and I fear a bit that the longer we are in this war and the longer we are in the winter, the problems might become bigger. Apart from von der Leyen, it was actually the Prime Minister of the country where I currently live in, Sanna Marin, Prime Minister of Finland. She actually said something very similar. We should have listened. Garry Kasparov, in his book Winter is Coming, actually called similarly, has this lovely sentence when he describes how the West, the US, Western Europe treated Putin. He's describing on the failures of Western presidents and prime ministers, how they were rewarding Russia with reset a few months after they invaded Georgia. The quote goes, they don't want to admit the truth, because if they admitted the truth, they would need to act.
Yeah.
But nobody wants to act.
Yeah. But maybe, and now I'm paraphrasing a bit someone who's not here, and namely Mr. Livelander with the flu. But he, when we were talking to him to this program, he said, and I'm making it a bit more sharp, so don't point to him for what I'm saying. But he said there were always different voices. According to the Baltics, this was nothing new. They were not surprised. There were also countries that saw the same things, but thought it would be possible to have Russia still integrated. And then he says, what matters now is that nobody has doubts about what we're dealing with. What's important is not to look back, but ahead. What's at stake, or why should we have this conversation about the lessons from 10 years and why we should have listened more?
We actually know it very well from our own European history. Have a look at how we treated the crimes of the Nazi regime and how we treated the crimes of the Soviet regime. We talked about the crimes of the Nazi regime. There were Nuremberg trials. There were many people jailed, imprisoned, sentenced. There was nothing like that after the fall of Soviet Union. The people are now coming back. The KGB tools and methods and TTPs are coming back.
Yeah.
If you don't condemn the mistakes of the past, you are doomed to repeat them. This will happen. My trouble with this sentence, like we should have listened more, is that I'm afraid I still don't see a big enough change of this approach. I see some people admitting this past mistake, but I actually don't see making it right this time. Many of the people I met in Brussels who were dismissing this threat are still in decision-making positions. Many journalists who are covering Ukrainian matters are actually covering them without actually talking to Ukrainians. They consider them biased or something, without giving a voice to these countries that have been affected by the Russians the most.
So you mean old diplomatic ways of dealing, of sort of, we look at one side, we look at the other side, are so persistent that they keep coming back?
Do you know the show Wire about the drug scene in Baltimore? There is this lovely scene where the policemen are talking about why those drug dealers are always a step ahead. And pardon my language, but the quote goes something like, when they fuck up, they get punished. When we fuck up, we get promoted.
Okay.
I have a bit of a feeling that we are not punishing our own mistakes enough. We are sometimes really rewarding triumph of hope over experience.
Frans?
Well, let me reinforce that. After 2014, the EU itself wrote a new security strategy, a global vision, where it says, listen, the European Union is experiencing an existential threat because of the refugee problem from the south, under Trump, the very tense transatlantic relationship, and because of the aggressive Russia on the eastern side after the annexation of the Crimea. In our country, each year, the Klingendahl Institute and the Hague Center for Strategic Studies published a strategic monitor where they said, listen, after 2014, we have re-entered the era of great power competition, and we better shape up, because we're squeezed in the middle, also referring to China with huge exposure for long lines of communication. But then things interfered. COVID. Here in the Netherlands, the stikstof crisis, right?
The nitrogen crisis.
Nitrogen, there you go. Right. Prior to the annexation of Crimea, we had a financial and economic crisis. We were just returning from Afghanistan. So there was no appetite really to embark on a very expensive strategic adventure. We had a downing of the MH17. We needed to retain a relationship with Russia in order to get access to data and all that. So each country had its own national motives to sort of not downplay the risk of Russia and China. But the warnings were there. And also in the lead into this war, Biden and Blinken, the US, actually from October last year, tried to warn all European capitals, because they had very detailed intel stating, listen, this won't be an exercise. It won't just be an exercise. This will turn into a war. The problem for the US was that they said the same in 2003 with Iraq about the weapons of mass destruction that weren't there in the end. So they had a bit of a credibility problem. Even Zelensky said, listen, I don't want to be too alarmist. He had his armed forces prepare for a war. But also in the Netherlands, various voices warned for, listen, guys, Putin has invested too much into it. So in that sense, I don't agree entirely with van der Leyen. The warnings were there. Some people actually took it seriously, but collectively we didn't act upon it. Also because, in particular, Macron and in particular Scholz, who had just been elected as Bundeskanzler, hadn't found his foot yet, and had this energy dependency issue that he needed to deal with.
So they were also wavering.
They were, on each individual country had its own motives, whether or not really to take this issue serious enough to act upon it, considering all the other issues that they need to be dealing with.
But then we come into the domain where you are walking each day, Brussels and the European Union. And well, actually you haven't been walking there that much because there have been so many crises going on outside of Brussels. But still, the idea of every individual nation having their own interests and at the same time trying to get a sort of collective outcome in that. There is now this sort of unique unity has been there up until now in Europe. Do you see that the lessons that we're talking about and the speech of von der Leyen, that there is willingness to look in the mirror about what has been going on?
I'm trying to think to go back a little bit further because I think I think already in the early 2000s there were so many signs that this direction could be taken, and even I think in Russia it was clear that people were thinking that this could become reality, but we didn't want to listen to it. And of course, von der Leyen is right that there were so many voices in the East that were already saying this is going to happen. So if you look, for instance, at the energy crisis that we're facing now, it's very clear that some of the countries have taken all the measures to be independent.
Yep.
Other countries have not taken any measures to become independent, and this can become a really serious threat for the unity in Europe. And this is actually what in Brussels people are very afraid of. Of course, they don't tell you this because it's all about solidarity clauses and all about solidarity and unity. But people are very afraid that if Spain decides to take its own energy, the UK decides to take its own energy, what kind of solidarity there will be in the end, because we've seen it in Brussels also during COVID crisis, that borders were closed in the beginning and that there was a panic. So this is what they are very afraid of. I think that if to acknowledge that you haven't listened is one thing, but then to change your behavior and really start listening, it's another thing. And I don't think that I see a lot of it. And it's also because it's power. If you have to listen to somebody else, it means that nobody's listening maybe to you anymore. It's also really about power.
That's cynical, right?
Yeah, it's politics, I think. So it means something also for the Dutch point of the Dutch position or the French position. If we suddenly start to have to listen to people who maybe know better, but they see things differently, it means a lot about changing your own behavior as well.
But then maybe also, Jacob, because now we've been talking about how did we get here from the perspective we haven't been listening enough, as if that was the only thing. There's also the fact that, and I think your work has to do a lot with that Putin and Russia actively also have been intervening in Europe for the past 10 years, trying to, to also create a narrative, to also maybe push for wedges in any unity that there might have been. Your work is actually all about that. You've been doing quite a lot of disinformation and how that works. Can you name an example of what has happened that we should understand right now?
I think we had enough warning shots. I mean, and your country actually had one of the most important ones in 2016.
The Ukraine referendum.
Precisely. That referendum that was targeted by the Russian disinformation ecosystem. And unfortunately, I'm afraid this hasn't really properly been investigated in order to find out how big a effect it was, what role it played in the decision-making process of the voters. I think this is actually the biggest difference between how Europe and the United States treat this problem. And I don't want to say that the United States model is ideal. It definitely isn't in many, many ways. But the fact that they are investigating the interference into the elections. And it's not just the famous Robert Mueller investigation. It was also investigation by multiple House and Senate committees, by local authorities of the state of New York, because the collusion happened in Donald Trump's building in New York City. There were multiple investigations into the 2016 interference, into the 2020 interference. Thanks to the investigation, you know how big the operation was, you know which people to punish. In Europe, I had a testimony in 2019 in the US Congress, and I was collecting the elections and referenda targeted by Russian disinformation campaigns. And I think I counted something like 18 between 2013 and 2019. So now we are probably somewhere close to 24. And I don't know about a single similar investigation anywhere in Europe. We are basically saying, you can attack our democracies and we don't do nothing about it. Feel free to go ahead.
Yeah. But maybe just because I think you've been trying to explain that quite a lot of times, but just to people also who are watching and are saying, okay, I mean, in the Netherlands, there was a sort of, and I don't know if you can call it investigation, but they were looking at media outings in the period, and they were saying, okay, some media outings were in the line of what the Kremlin tried to push. But then it's the next question, how do you distinguish between believing what has been pushed, or actively pushing, or falsely, or with bad intention pushing it? How do you distinguish that when you talk about what has been going on, apart from what you are pushing for, the big investigation into money streams, for example, but also about in a public debate? How do you distinguish? How do you assess that? Because that's something you've been also working on.
A very big part of it is really trying to document as precisely as possible of what is happening in the disinformation ecosystem. I've seen many times that a story started in Dmitry Kiselyov's show, one of the most important propagandists. It starts there on a Sunday, it gets reprinted by the Russian media on a Monday, translated into all the local versions of Russia Today and Sputnik on a Wednesday, and by Friday you have it on a local, independent website, independent underlying mainstream, but they are just parroting Russian propaganda, wittingly or not. I can't distinguish whether the last piece of the food chain is controlled by the Russians. I don't know. But they are definitely influenced by the Russians. We see that they are spreading their messages. So if you document it over a period of time, I think you can have at least a basic idea whether this or that outlet, let's take InfoWars or Prison Planet, whether they are publishing Kremlin propaganda deliberately, like on a daily basis for several years, or whether they made it by mistake. And I mean, don't get me wrong, some Western outlets have published Kremlin propaganda by mistake, but then they actually correct the mistake. I used to be a journalist as well. You make mistakes, but then you issue a correction. I got fined, like, I don't know, 20% of my salary.
I thought 20% of the time. I was.
As far as I remember, during the referendum, it was really pretty clear already then that it was greatly influenced by Russia. There was no doubt about it, and it was
that video. That's clear. That video with burning of the Dutch flag.
Oh, there were many more examples how big Russian influence was in this. In this.
But were there lessons learned from that?
There were no more referenda after this, I think. Yeah. I think we're pretty.
If I may, the topic that we touch upon here is hybrid threats, right? Mm-hmm. Is one of these instruments that Russia used to influence the public discourse, the political discourse, the integrity of our elections, and the foundation of our societies. The openness of our societies make us vulnerable. It also makes us resilient if we take care. And I think that after 2014, at a policy level, the EU, both NATO and EU, have actually taken the hybrid threats very seriously. The EU has developed this program called Resilience, right, to try to foster resilience on an EU level, but also on a national level. Most countries have become aware of this and try to reinforce resilience on a national level, critical infrastructure protection, guarding about mis and disinformation. The Swedes have actually distributed 4.8 million leaflets to households, individual households, warning them that don't be surprised if at some day electricity won't be there, gas won't be there, internet won't work, and potable water will also not flow from the tap. Go back to resilience on a household level. We're back to the atmosphere of the Cold War. So in that sense, various countries have taken this very seriously on a national level. Whether that actually will do the trick, we don't know, but I think we're in a better position right now than we were in 2014. We have become aware of the extreme right and the extreme left political sections of our political systems that have been influenced by Russia. We have seen the move towards the extreme right in certain segments of Europe, also fueled by the refugee influx that was also then capitalized upon by Russia. And I think these days we have become aware, what you mentioned, that This really resonates closely what happened in the interbellum of the last century, what happened in Germany. We have become aware of the danger of the extreme right, the neo-Nazis, what Biden called semi-fascism in his own country. So in that sense, I think we have become more aware. Whether we are better in defending ourselves, I'm not sure. Legislation is a problem. Right, legislation about countering cyber attacks, but also the governance of security is an issue. We have stovepiped governance structure. Each ministry takes care of a certain policy section. If you really want to defend against hybrid threats, you need to restructure the governance of security. You need to bring together all these various institutions and governmental...
Take the stovepipes away.
Exactly. Yeah. That is what's happening slowly. Our own WRR report of 2017, the ministry was the official advisory board for our government, said, listen, you need to create a National Security Council, much like what the Finns have done, or what the US has done, or what the UK has done.
So the movement is there, you say. Are you also that optimistic because you work at the center of countering hybrid threats? So that's actually
a result of precisely these movements Frans was describing. I think in 2016, Federica Mogherini, the head of the EU diplomacy, and Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, agreed that EU and NATO should counter hybrid threats like in a better cooperation, and the center in Helsinki is the result of that. I think since 2016, and again, this is slightly a paradoxical thing because we had elections and referenda targeted before that. In my country, the 2013 presidential elections, they were affected by the pro-Russian disinformation ecosystem. The Scottish independence referendum was definitely fed by the Russian trolls as well, as any independence movement in Catalonia, in northern Italy, because they love to weaken the country. So we had all the signs, and yet the EU response got better only after the American elections, because they got so much media coverage. It wasn't triggered by the events happening in the EU, it was triggered by the events happening overseas. Anyway, we do see some positive development. The fact that hybrid attacks got mentioned in the last strategic concept of NATO as something that could trigger Article 5 is a progress similar actually to...
What do you mean with that? Because Article 5 says if one country gets attacked, then all NATO countries are attacked?
Exactly that, yes. So a hybrid attack against the Netherlands would mean that the Czechs would have to run to your defense.
But when is it a hybrid attack?
I don't think they have figured out the definitions yet. No. But at least, no, I'm not saying it's perfect. Actually, many good documents were created. The trouble is they weren't implemented. So Frans talked about this building up of our resilience. Many of the countermeasures are focused on that, yet still there is like the B you need, and that is also actually to try and limit, punish, deter the aggressor. Yeah. Just like you're fighting illegal drugs, it's not just saying the kids you should do sports, don't do drugs. You also punish the drug dealers, you also go after the organized crime. So going after the supply chain, going after the Russians. This imposing of costs was introduced in the EU's action plan on disinformation in 2018, I believe. It's been 4 years, it still hasn't happened. So some of the documents are great, just the implementation isn't very fast.
And maybe, it's probably true that we've become more aware, more resilient, hopefully, but at the same time, I'm not so optimistic. If I look at the Russian influence directly in our parliament, in our broadcasting system, I mean, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of attraction, apparently, to people, to this Russian...
You mean Forum for Democracy?
Yeah, and I mean, there's the broadcasting...
The unheard Netherlands.
The unheard Netherlands, that's far too loud, spreading all this kind of propaganda, and it's within our democratic system. It's I don't know how we should counter this. What kind of systematic? How you can?
Yeah, because actually,
and apparently it's really attractive. I mean, people vote for these parties, people look at these programs, and we're allowing them to watch this. I don't know what kind of resilience this is in the democracy. Of course, we can say democracy is strong enough so that these words can also be heard. But it's pretty scary.
Yeah, but because then I wonder, how do you deal with the tension between, on the one hand, trying to defend, because I don't know if it's a false contradiction or if it's a contradiction or not, but people are also saying, how can you defend an open society where there's room for people to say what they want to say, where there's freedom of press, you don't want to regulate what is being said on websites, and at the same time you want to do something about things everyone, how do you say it, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck, you see it, but still you have to sacrifice something to be able to do something about that. What are interventions or smart ways you can handle that?
I don't think we are that helpless, and we actually, obviously freedom of speech is sacrosanct and is very important. However, we already do have limitations on it. Yeah. False marketing. If I'm a doctor, I can't tell you you have cancer and then tell you a week later I was just kidding, actually, you don't have any cancer. But it was my freedom of speech, actually, too. Yeah. We punish incitement to hatred. We punish incitement to violence. We make very clear that some speech is illegal. And actually, if you have a look at the disinformation-oriented outlets, a lot of that is actually incitement to hatred. A lot of that is incitement to violence. Go to the streets, Capitol riots in the US. A lot of it is really threatening people's lives and health. The COVID-related disinformation, heavily influenced boosted by the Kremlin. You know, you should drink bleach to yourself. This threatens people's health. We have laws against that, so please, let's use them.
Yeah. Frans?
I really want to be optimistic. We are resilient. I think we have refound the institutions of the West and what it means to be in the West and to be what our values are. But I've also seen what in the US, I've lived in the US 3 times, what can happen when a group like QAnon, when alternative facts are being bandied about by senior political leaders who actually deny there's something called truth and facts, how rapidly that can undermine your society. And one of the wonderful books that have come out of the Helsinki think tank where you work, but also the Swedes with the bridge about how countering hybrid threats. One of the recommendations they give is try to avoid polarizing rhetoric. The thing that has happened over the past decade is that the middle ground in political spectrum has basically lost ground. It's very attractive to pay attention to what's the extreme left or the extreme right. So the middle ground, the middle parties, the conservative but also the moderate parties have lost ground to the polarizing voices in the media. That really hasn't helped us. Trump really capitalized on that. He has made outrageous claims. The extreme right on the Republican Party is really capitalized on that. COVID really boosted their influence, and that is one of the weaknesses. Yes, we have legislation.
Where's the optimism then?
Well, the optimism. I was more worried a couple of years ago than I am right now, but that is precisely because of Putin's aggressiveness. He has transgressed beyond the line that we can't ignore anymore. I think for many people it has opened up our eyes. The aggression of Putin is really close to us, whereas China is remote. The US, okay, well, that's a US problem. This is really tangible. It is violence, is 6 million refugees, 1 million in Poland. We see the economic effects, so this really drives home.
We have to relate to it. That's where the optimism is in that sense. But at the same time...
Yeah, but it's also, I think it's quite a good incentive for populism, unfortunately, what is going on. I mean, I was watching the debate yesterday in our parliament, and this is exactly what is interesting for a populist party.
But maybe before...
Wat hebben we aan vrijheid als we niks te vreten hebben? This is pretty much straight from the Kremlin.
So how should we then, because then before we dive, because I think that's a fair point, but before we dive into the whole political debate of yesterday in the Netherlands, how should we then, for example, NATO has put forward a new strategic plan for the coming years. They're working on that. But on the one hand, you have the challenges on the ground, you have the real challenges, well, the hybrid challenges are also real, but you have the challenges about what troops do we deploy? How do we work together on the battlefield and around it? But then you also have the attention you need to pay to hybrid warfares, and also how do we keep our societies resilient, which is, I think, becoming more important for NATO than it ever was. And then we have Russia, but this is close, and China might not be so close, but in hybrid warfare, China is as close as Russia in that sense. So if you look at NATO as a correspondent, are they searching? Are they confident in the plans for the next year, or are they actually looking in a black tunnel and also thinking we have no idea what's coming at us yet?
You mean from the cyber? I think it's easier for you to answer.
But I mean first in the political aspect of it as NATO. Do you think NATO has a renewed confidence these past years?
Oh, yeah, of course. This war has given the whole NATO. Of course, they have new confidence. I've been to Madrid. I saw that taking place, and I think that it's pretty clear that the unity that they found within NATO, the expansion of NATO, it's something that is unimaginable maybe even a few years ago. And then the way in which they reacted also with the rapid reaction force, the immense build-up in numbers, in money, in ideas, it's pretty clear. But it's all, of course, it's sometimes it is in contrast with what you come across on the ground. If you say people are resilient towards Russian propaganda, I've covered a lot of demonstrations here, and I talk to these people, I meet them, and I'm worried about that. And I think it's also sometimes there's a big contrast between what political leaders are thinking and doing and what is actually going on. Yeah. And this worries me from time to time. And I think a lot of responsibility also is in the hands of these political leaders, because you say that a lot of the moderate parties, that we listen more to the extremes in the media. But I would say that a lot of the more so-called moderate party have also become part of the more extreme, just in order to not to lose too many voters. So they are part of the problem, and these are the same people, of course, that are creating these so-called solutions. So they have the responsibility as well.
Yeah. How do you look at the future of NATO in that sense? Because it feels like they're playing chess on many boards right now, and you have to prioritize with everything you're doing. How can we make the most significant steps in hybrid, but also in conventional warfare? Do you see a good sense of realism in the plans that NATO has?
Really hard for me to evaluate. It's been quite a few years since I've been out of Brussels, so I'm not that close to this decision-making center. However, I would also agree that the NATO, thanks to Kremlin's actions, has become definitely more attractive. It's been just, 4 or 5 years since the brain dead comments?
Yeah,
2017 or 18. So from brain dead into Sweden actually
Macron called NATO brain dead.
2019.
Yeah. To Sweden actually deciding that our 400-year policy of being neutral goes to the bin and we are joining NATO. That's quite a strong development. What pains me a little bit is that this price is again paid rather in Ukrainian lives rather than actually by us. So it's actually them paying for our mistakes. That's slightly frustrating.
Yeah. Can I add to that? It is frustrating, but we've come a long way. 2014, the Wales Summit, NATO said to the European countries, start expending more money on defense, go to 2%. If we reach it in the Netherlands in 2024, it's a decade after 2014. That gives you an impression of the glaciality of that progress. That time frame was also marked by an undermining of the credibility of NATO by Trump. Yeah. He basically said he ignored the guarantee of Article 5. He basically said, listen, I won't guarantee Article 5. So NATO was in dire straits in that period. That was also the time frame that Macron said, listen, NATO is brain dead. Now, with the invasion in Ukraine, NATO has found a new lease of life, a new purpose. After 2014, Article 5, collective defense, became again the prime reason for having NATO in the first place. We also discovered after 2014 that actually we can't guarantee Article 5 to the Baltic states because of Russian modernization in Kaliningrad were completely filled with surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-surface missiles. So we recognize we had a huge problem. And it took a very long time for countries actually to do something about it. We had to enhance forward presence, wonderful, a tripwire force. But if you can't protect it from the air, if you can't reinforce it, it's not a tripwire force, they are sitting ducks. Right? That's why, once this invasion started, the Baltic states said, listen, this wonderful deterrence strategy by punishment should be replaced by a deterrence by denial strategy. And I'll explain that a bit. Deterrence by punishment basically says to Russia, listen, we can't prevent you from crossing the border, but we'll give you a wonderful smack on the head. It's going to hurt so much, you really don't want to do that. But we can't stop you. For the Baltic states, that's not really reassuring, considering what's happening in Ukraine. So they said, listen, we want to have a deterrence by denial strategy, where you communicate to Russia, listen, you can't even cross the border, and if you do, we'll defeat you, and you will get a bump on the head. So that is the guarantee they want now. And that's where NATO is moving towards with the new strategic concept. It's a forward defense concept. We aren't there yet. It requires massive investments, well beyond the 2%. We haven't realized that. But in that sense, NATO is really making progress seriously.
Yeah. But if we then, lastly, before we go to the audience, talk about, okay, what are, on the one hand, just to be able to do something about the situation in Ukraine, there needs to be unity, there needs to be hard talk in that sense that no more, I mean, many lines have been crossed, but no more lines can be crossed without returning to that. But on the same hand, this is also the momentum of making long-term choices, maybe, because so many is in flux, and there is this more sense of unity among countries to do something. For example, the discussion of Finland joining NATO has been on the table quite some times, and it's becoming more realistic than it was 5 years ago. What do you think, in your opinion, should be the things that we should be focusing on right now?
Taking a look at it from like the more long-term or more like strategic view, and it might sound actually like banal, however I do strongly believe that we really should be taking more seriously our values, our founding documents. If you have a look at the UN Charter, at the founding EU documents, at the founding NATO treaties, at our constitutions in the states, there's always the talk about defending democracy, rule of law, freedom, human rights. And we weren't doing a very good job, actually, at protecting it. Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom ever since 2013, the Maidan Revolution. The Maidan Revolution was because Yanukovych, then the president, decided to make a U-turn, and after negotiating with the EU, the association agreement, he decided, based on discussion with Putin, no, I will not do that, and we are going to be better friends with Russia and not so much associated with the West. And that's when Ukrainians said, no, you are not going to do that. We actually want to be associated with the EU. That's why the revolution started. And then the revolution was beaten by Yanukovych's thugs and special forces sent from Russia. This conflict has ever since November 2013 been about democracy versus autocracy, between freedom and unfreedom, between human rights and actually might of the stronger. And we should have been on the right side ever since the beginning. I think if we did that, the situation perhaps wouldn't have to be so horrible as it is today.
Do you think there's a scenario that in a few years we'll be back at the situation which was before the invasion in Ukraine, in that sense that sometimes Baltic states feel a bit like a buffer zone between the West and Russia, not really part of NATO, not really, and at the same time leaning a bit towards that side, sometimes being pushed to the other side? Do you think that's a realistic scenario?
I don't even want to imagine that, no. I mean, 100% of my work effort is actually going precisely in the opposite direction, so I would probably have to, basically stop working in my line of work, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so then we skip that question for now. Maybe that's maybe better. At the same time, how do you see if we look at the next steps? Because we started with the speech of Putin. There's going to be a lot of. The military aspect of it is being covered every day. We see every day about the Ukrainians advancing, and at the same time now Russia with the mobilization trying to do something to push back. But how do you see the geopolitical side of it on the short term playing out? What are the next steps that you see are going to be taken or should be taken?
Assuming that we can retain the unity, I think the clear message towards Putin will have to remain: aggression will not pay. Simply, you can't get away with levels of aggression like this. That should be the strategic message, and you can send that home in various ways. Keep on supporting Ukraine with military, but also start rebuilding Ukraine, and that's what's happening right now already. Accession to EU, right? Security guarantees. I think Zelensky has actually drawn up, or not Rasmussen or Vogelson has actually produced a report on behalf of Zelensky, where it states that, listen, at some point in the future, what the end state should look like for Ukraine is security guarantees by the West, militarization, rebuilding of its military, strong exercises and connections with NATO troops, not necessarily NATO membership, but strong connections, having regular exercises, rebuilding Ukraine and getting Ukrainian society and economy completely integrated in the EU, even without full EU membership, but perhaps a special status. That, I think, was in that report that was produced 2 weeks ago by the former Secretary General of NATO.
And now, sorry for being the grim one on the table, but that's quite a long list of things you'd like to see. Do you see any of that, like, do you estimate any of that like being really realistic of happening?
Yes, as long as Biden remains in the White House.
Okay. So send him fruit shakes.
For instance, yes.
Yeah.
No, but I'm serious about that. If Trump or a Trump-like Republican comes in the White House, it's the end of the support for Ukraine.
Do you also think that?
I would be a bit worried, yeah. I would definitely be a lot worried, yeah.
And without Europe, the US has its own geopolitical interests, and that includes Ukraine. China is looking what's happening in Ukraine and how the US responds to what's happening out there. So the US under Biden will simply not want to give the impression that it is not willing to guard the international order.
Yeah.
If I may just add two-finger to that, actually, given I used to work in a US think tank, you could overhear discussions like, why do you guys in Europe actually still expect that Americans will be paying for your security? Why aren't you actually doing more? All the think tanks and civil society organizations that are working on countering Russian disinformation are paid by the US and by the UK. There's maybe a little bit of EU funding, but US and UK is the majority of that.
Kisha, maybe to conclude, because it's maybe a bit dull, but you wrote this book 10 years ago, and one of the things you also wrote in there was that there was a growing resistance against Putin in the book. Now, 10 years later, if we say how to deal with Russia, we also need to look at what's happening inside Russia. We've seen now the protests today. Also, we also seen the arrests and people being drafted. Would you still consider it a growing resistance if you would write this book right now?
Yeah. If I remember correctly about this book, to give a little bit of context, it was written in 2010-11 when there was the big protest. Over 100,000 people got into the streets, not only in Moscow, but also all over Russia. And I remember that everybody felt somehow hopeful, but this is also what is, I think, very deceiving, that we project our own hope, which is from mostly Western, on a country which thinks in a very different way. And that's why it's important to have people on the ground, correspondents and friends, Russians, connections, who can explain that this is that what we want to see, what we desperately want to believe, that change is coming, that is actually not coming. So if I remember correctly, in this book, I already took some of this in mind, saying that, Russia's changing, but we're not really sure in what direction. And also in those days, maybe the friends that came to Bolotnaya protesting were hopeful, but some of our friends that were older and growing up in Soviet years were already warning us that might have the opposite reaction. Maybe in 10 years, in which we are now, our borders will be closed. And in those days, we didn't believe them. I didn't believe them, but they were right. I mean, it's not, the borders can be closed, if not now, then maybe next couple of months. So I think this is what we should always keep in mind when dealing with Russia, that we don't take our own way of thinking, how we grew up, that how we believe, and that we can change our lives and our societies, that we cannot project this on this country, because it's very deceiving.
It's absolutely precise. There was actually also another lovely book by Keir Giles from Chatham House, Moscow Rules, where he writes exactly about that actually when Russia uses our Western terms, it's actually, again, part of this information influence or disinformation influence. You know, they talk about elections and we actually think, oh, elections, we know that. No, no, that's not what's happening in Russia, no. And that's why I'm still actually angry at some of the like solid media, but they do sometimes still repeat this nonsense about, pro-Russian separatists in Kherson organizing a referendum. Everything in that sentence is wrong, apart from the word Kherson. There are no pro-Russian separatists. There haven't been there. There are some Russian-backed soldiers, thugs, and there will be no referendum. They are already deciding it on the TV screen that, next week they are joining us.
Yeah.
What kind of referendum is that?
Then maybe lastly, and then we go to the audience, because your work actually, well, you've just been saying my work. I mean, I should be stopping if I don't have hope that it doesn't go back to where we used to be. What's the most important thing you think? Because you came all the way from Finland to Amsterdam to have this talk. What's the most important thing you say? Please remember this, or this is for me so important that I want people also to leave the audience with that in mind the coming months when they're watching what's going on in Ukraine.
I really think it might be useful to get back to von der Leyen's statement and start listening to those who were proven to be right. I remember in 2011 when Edward Lucas, I believe it was at least 2011, when Ed Lucas from then The Economist, now he's in SIPA, wrote the book The New Cold War. He was called a warmonger and a hawkish person. He was right. Garry Kasparov, when he was warning that, the dictator doesn't really ask himself, why should I do something? He asks, why shouldn't I? What happens to me if I do something? And yes, Putin's behavior really copied what Kasparov was outlining. He always makes the next step. You allowed me this? Okay, I will make the next step. We didn't react to the first Anschluss of a European territory since Adolf Hitler. We didn't react to it properly. So Syria came. We didn't react to the war crimes in Syria. So we got Ukraine again. So start listening to these guys who were proven to be right for many, many, many years. That would be probably the best thing to take out of the situation.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any people who would like to ask a question, make a comment, miss something in the discussion? Yes, we have a microphone there's also a bigger microphone so that people at home can also listen to the question. There was a question on the third row. Yeah. Hello, good afternoon.
Thank you. I was just wondering, because we always said that Russia only listens to power and to actions. And yesterday I just checked also on the internet on our alert level. The US alert level is still on DEFCON 3. I was wondering, and I'd want to ask this also to France, why are we not sending a very, very strong signal, raising our alert troop levels to DEFCON 2, sending strategic assets, like, for example, B-2 bombers to England, showing Russia the willingness that there is a red line, a very clear red line, that as soon as they use tactical nuclear weapons, we will react very forcefully. And also, maybe we go a bit too far, considering to giving tactical nuclear weapons to Ukraine to hedge the risk that Russia will use nuclear weapons against Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Actually, the question is, shouldn't we, when Putin is being threatening, I will use it, that is no bluff, shouldn't we also prepare for using it, or at least putting it in place that we might be able to use it and deter? That's the question. Frans.
Right. On the last suggestion, giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine, that is a non-starter because of non-proliferation treaties and all that. And also because you don't know what's going to happen to the nuclear weapons, and you will perhaps be actually fueling a nuclear escalation. You don't want to have that you can't control. But the other suggestions might actually already be in place. Ever since February 24th, the US is flying with B-52s, patrolling the borders of Eastern Europe. It's flying tankers out there. It's flying AWACS, radar aircraft, that's looking way into that. We actually deployed in the Netherlands, along with the French and also the Brits, F-35s and other fighter aircraft to Romania and other countries, also to Poland. We have deployed Patriot systems, all meant to send a signal that NATO is alert. And we don't know what's happening behind the screens of our NATO headquarters. I know for a fact that the Brits and the American intelligence services are monitoring very closely what's happening with the Russian nuclear arsenals. And no doubt they have also dusted off, the procedures for our own nuclear tactics. However, there's a reason why yesterday, after the nuclear rhetoric of Putin, Western leaders did actually not follow through on that. Actually, they stepped away from the nuclear rhetoric so as not to actually incentivize Putin to go any step further. Actually, what they did, I said, listen, basically, they ignored that nuclear threat. Not necessarily believing that it's pure bluff, but perhaps with the hope that by ignoring that threat, basically, trying to diffuse precisely the value of that threat that Putin tries to achieve.
Yeah.
So perhaps our own Prime Minister went a step too far, saying, listen, this was a panic move by Putin. Putin doesn't panic, not when it comes to nuclear weapons. But all the leaders, including our own and also our Minister of Foreign Affairs, downplayed the threat in the sense we've seen this before. It is not likely. We take it seriously, but things haven't really changed so far.
Yeah.
So trying to diffuse the tension out there. But behind that, there's lots of things ongoing. The fact that NATO has this new strategic concept with forward defense is a cost that Putin had never expected he needed to incur. The fact that he actually is the greatest salesman of NATO by enlarging NATO with Sweden and Finland is a cost he had never expected to incur. So things are actually happening, and some of the suggestions you have there are actually in place already.
Yeah. There's also a question in the back, but then also Kisha, just to add to that, then also you as a journalist interviewing politicians. I mean, if I listen correctly to France, Rutte was not responding to the question of the journalist; he was responding to the international translation of that with Putin. Do you notice that also? That the people you're talking to or speaking to are more answering what they'd like Putin to hear than what the journalist wants to hear?
Yeah, that's politics. Yeah, politics always give their own answers. Yeah.
Okay, I knew that. Yeah. Okay, in the back, there's another question. Yeah.
Yesterday, Putin blamed the West for everything, explicitly blaming the West, but implicitly telling his people things might be a bit tougher than we thought, but only implicitly. He never mentioned that times would be tough. That's Putin. In the West, in my view, over the centuries, over the years, the decades, the century, things have always gone up and down. I think many politicians fear to say to their voters, this might be a tough one for us. Ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, voters were always told, from now on, it's heaven. Things can only go up. And I see that politicians in the West are afraid to tell their voters, this is a period where things will go down.
Yeah.
And it takes courage to say that.
Yeah.
Please comment.
Yeah, I was saying that was a statement, but it was a perfect end. Please comment. Jacob, how are you listening to that?
I really don't have much of a comment. I think you said it, sir. Yeah, this is problematic. I think if that's again a bit of a difference between a dictatorship and a democracy, isn't it? I mean, our leaders change. Whereas in the Kremlin you have 20 years the same man. He always gets a new minister, prime minister, president to play with. So the first year he comes with this, everybody before me was just an idiot and now I will make it right with the Russians. And then in the second year he's slowly finding out that maybe it won't go his way. And when he finally finds out that the mistake is not his, he's already on his way out and a new guy is coming in and the cycle repeats. So if your memory goes to the last elections and if your plan for the country is only until tomorrow's opinion poll, then obviously that's wrong.
But is it true in that sense that I've also heard the minister Baerbock in Germany, Macron also saying we
very
should
explicitly warning the population that things will not be as they used to be, being very explicit about it. So I think it's mostly our prime minister who's quite absent in this field. This is, I think, the Finnish prime minister, the Swedish prime minister, they've all mentioned that things are going to be really tough, also especially this winter. But the Belgian prime minister mentioned the next 10 winters, so he's a bit in the overdrive. And I was thinking that, according to Putin, that you mentioned that he's saying just a bit difficult. It might become just a bit more difficult. This is something, of course, that he can never tell Russians that it's a disaster. But everybody knows now that he's forced to mobilize so many people. It's clear. You don't have to say it. It's visible to everybody.
Yeah.
Can I
Maybe
add?
short, Frans? Yeah.
Short, oops.
Sorry, but we can do a bit more questions.
That gentleman has history in his backpack, right? You have a frame of reference, right? We both lived through the old Cold War. That is our frame of reference. And we lived through these optimistic 90s, where Francis Fukuyama said, we are the end of history in the last man, right? Liberalism, democracy is the wave of the future, and we're going to export that. The current generation of students don't have that background, that frame of reference. So I bring to them slides with the optimism of the 90s, that book, the Fukuyama, just as an iconic book. And then I tell them what the Cold War looked like, and then I tell them what Medvedev warned us in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen in the West, we are entering a new Cold War. The disconcerting fact about the new Cold War is, compared to the old Cold War, is that in the old Cold War, both parties, the West and the East, were out there to maintain the status quo and stability. There were arms treaties, there were nuclear reduction treaties, there were inspections ongoing, there was a hotline, and the borders in Europe were fixed, black and white, were not to be withdrawn. Currently in the Kremlin, we have a guy who's aggressive, who wants to redraw the borders in Europe. There is no red line anymore between the White House and the Kremlin. There's aggression. There's no more arms reductions treatments and conversations ongoing. So the current Cold War is actually much more dangerous than the one that you and I lived in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, yeah. There's the next question, a few seats further. Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. There's more extreme right voting. We saw it in Sweden in the elections, but also the upcoming elections in Italy. And in Brussels, it took a pretty long time to get the sanction packages that were used to coerce Putin. Do you think that in a year, this more populist voters, right-wing voters, will have an effect on the stance of the EU towards Putin?
Kisha?
Yeah, definitely. This is what is, of course, on everybody's mind in Brussels. We have elections coming up in Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, in our country also in March. So, of course, this will have a big effect on the discussions. And we were referring earlier to Orbán in Hungary, but with Orbán is also something else that's taking place within his own country, because he wants billions of EU subsidies that he's not getting at this moment. So he uses this threat of blocking EU sanctions to put the pressure in order to get this money. It might work, it might not work, I don't know. But he will definitely get more support from different countries that have also these doubts about whether we in the West are not paying higher a price than the people that the sanctions are supposed, or the country that in Russia that the sanctions are supposed to work. So it's going to take a lot of effort in Brussels to convince population that they need to be that we have to keep this unity into solidarity, because otherwise, in the long run, as you were referring to, it might be not only Ukraine that's suffering, but it might be Poland, might be the Baltic countries. But this is going to be a big test, I think, next winter. Absolutely.
Jacob?
You were talking about extreme right, and I think it's a little bit unfair to leave out the extreme left. They are actually also quite skillful at acting in the Kremlin's interests. However, I do admit that it makes sense in the case of far right, because Russia is a fascist country. Timothy Snyder uses the word schizo-fascism, when the real fascists are actually accusing their victims of being fascist, which we see happening in Ukraine. In the far left, it really doesn't make any sense. For some reason, the communists of the world still see Moscow as the sanctimonium, and yet it's the country with the biggest inequality in the world. The smallest amount of people owns the biggest wealth. But there were analyses of votes in the European Parliament done by the Swedish journalist Patrik Oksanen, I believe, and they are showing that both the extreme right and extreme left, they will vote on many issues differently. Whenever it comes to Russia, annexation of Crimea, Ukraine, sanctions, they will vote as one. So the extreme right and extreme left here is really like in a unity. But yeah, there might be actually elections in Slovakia as well. They are rebuilding their government right now. From what I heard, they are also a little bit afraid that some more pro-Russian politicians might get to power.
Maybe just a short follow-up question, because when dealing with Russia, we're talking about EU, NATO. We haven't been talking about Turkey, which is also maybe a whole different topic for 2 hours. But still, I mean, I remember that Erdogan in the beginning was saying, I can be the sort of bridge, I can be the sort of negotiator. That was the kind of role he wanted to be perceived. If we listen to the question of the lady there about how in 1 year time the sanction packages and the things we want to do to Russia look like. Is Turkey important in that sense? Because they have been using, for example, the migration crisis in the past to also urge the EU to take, well, steps in their direction.
Well, Turkey is not in the EU. They are in NATO, but they are not in the EU, so they shouldn't be capable of torpedoing the sanctions. However, it is impossible to deny that their role in this conflict is slightly strange, to say the least. I mean, I'm glad that they are providing Bayraktar drones to Ukraine. That's nice.
Yeah. Okay. There was a question in front, yeah. And then we'll go to the back to Henri.
Yeah, hi. Putin in his speech yesterday also said that he is in war with NATO. So it seems that for him is no way back anymore. He has to win this war. So he's going to put these million Russians on these occupied territories, and he is prepared to hold it. And for him, it becomes existential threat, basically. If he loses this war, he loses his position, and he loses everything he has. So the question is, how far are we prepared to go? He's going to be there and hold the position, and he has to proclaim the victory.
Yeah, yeah. Frans?
It's a $1 million question, isn't it? Let's step back to February 24th, where the West was only willing to supply self-defense weapons, Stinger missiles, anti-tank missiles. Then when it was apparent that Kiev still was actually surviving and Russia was having huge problems militarily, we became willing to deploy, to send more sophisticated weapons. In the Netherlands, we sent howitzers, for instance. The HIMARS missiles became all of a sudden an option when the battlefield started to shift. And so I think battlefield reality is a factor in this. As long as Ukraine is winning, I think we will be willing to keep on supplying Ukraine with increasingly advanced weaponry, perhaps even at some point F-16s, for instance, and perhaps the ATACMS, the long-range, the 300-kilometer weapon system might actually come into play. I think for most European countries and for the US, the red line is to become actively involved in this war, in the sense that you are deploying troops and ships and aircraft yourself into the country. Having said that, there's a current debate in the US right now about what the US would do if the nuclear option comes into play. One general said, listen, we can easily deploy, not with NATO, but as the US, we can easily deploy a no-fly zone over the Ukraine. We can blast away the Russians very easily. The reason for saying that is that we need to relearn the dynamics and the lexicon of escalation. Putin should also be fearful of our ability to escalate and our willingness, our resolve to escalate at some point. If you constantly communicate that you're fearful of escalation more than the other guy, you will be hijacked by that fear. And I think the US, being a major power, of course, superpower, of course, has never really relearned that language. For various reasons, over the past 3 decades in Europe, we've also always been very shy about this escalation thing. Our default reaction has always been de-escalate. Sometimes, if you're opposing an authoritarian leader, that might not be the best solution, actually. We've seen that with Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. Sometimes you need to show the resolve to escalate. And that is what's ongoing, that's a debate ongoing in the US right now, precisely because of this nuclear rhetoric by Putin.
Yeah, maybe Kisha short, because you also heard him saying at war with NATO. What's the response to that? That you hear around politically to that? Because the question is, how long are we willing to if he's willing to go to war and not have a clear ending until he gets what he wants, because it would be a failure? How long can we persist? What are the answers if you ask that to someone and say off the record, what do you expect?
I think the reaction to this speech is mostly he can say that he's doing whatever, he can say whatever he wants. He can say he's in war with NATO, but NATO is not in war with Russia. And for the reasons that Frans Ozinga is mentioning, they don't, of course, want to be in this war with Russia. So it's not, I think, so much a matter of the record. This is just what you would hear. Yeah.
Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, brilliant answer. And just to make it like a little bit lighter, Putin and his propaganda machine, they have spent the last 8 years persuading Russians that Ukrainians are no people, they are no nation, it's not even a language, basically subhumans, and it's okay if we kill them. And so now he has to explain why he is losing to these subhuman who are completely incompetent and they are not even a people. He can't say that, right? So he has to say he's fighting mighty NATO there. So I really see it more like as a propaganda figure. Yeah. However, it is true that yes, he has done a lot of things to NATO countries that if a NATO country would do the same to Russia, they would see it as a declaration of war. Many of the disinformation campaigns, according to Russian military doctrines, are actually a war measure. The assassinations on the EU soil, like in the case of Litvinenko, the assassination attempt in Salisbury, Hangoshvili in Germany. So he's done many things to NATO countries that I think actually NATO countries should be taking a little bit more seriously. But then we are again back at the question we already discussed.
Yes. So let's go to the last question in the back. There's one last question.
Time flies. Really? My God.
Since we're talking about Putin, I'm going to cheat a little bit and ask two short questions. One, how much of this is a consequence of the withdrawal of the Western troops from Afghanistan? And secondly, a negotiated peace is necessary, according to certain commentators. And I was wondering what do you see as a possibility to assure Putin and maybe his successor, that could be way worse than Putin, that the West, NATO doesn't really want to have a war, is not really a threat? If I listened to what was said this evening and I were Russian, and I would be very concerned because I didn't really see an opening to that. So if you care to comment on that.
Yep. And what was the first question shortly? Because
Afghanistan.
The withdrawal of Afghanistan.
Oh, well, if you understood the question, then perfect. And you can also answer it. So start with the first question. Yeah.
You would see some interpretations that actually Putin saw this as a sign of weakness of the US, and that this might have contributed to the decision to actually launch the war. So yes, I think the short answer is that this might have played a role.
Yeah. On the other hand, we had been withdrawn from Afghanistan over the past decade. So there was an Afghanistan hangover already in 2011, 2012. Since 2014, we basically relegated ourselves to just training Afghanistans. So it had been already, was disappearing on the security political agenda already. So in that sense, Russia wants to interpret it as a sign of weakness. But from our perspective, sorry, we can't hear.
It wasn't very well organized.
And that's also the third question, but really short then.
Yeah. But
didn't warn the West.
The second one is that wars don't always end with negotiations. Sometimes war ends because one guy is heavily, completely defeated and is willing to accept that he's being defeated. And perhaps that's necessary in this case. Zelensky will never accept a concession right now. He's built a huge profile and platform he can't withdraw from, stating, listen, this war will only end with all Russians withdrawn from Ukraine. He can't accept a concession where Novorossiya becomes the new border out there, because that includes some of his harbors. And because he doesn't have harbor, 70% of the in and export has gone. So even if you're sovereign, your economy is not viable anymore. Yep. Apart from Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, 6 million refugees, rebuilding Ukraine society will cost 500 billion. So there's no way he's going to allow concessions.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Kisha?
No, not at this moment.
Okay, then I think we're going to get a drink also. Thanks so much for talking. I'd like to thank first Frans Ozinga and Kisha Hekster. Give them a warm applause. And lastly, because you flew all the way from Prague, it was actually because you came from Prague, but still you flew all the way here. A big warm for our special guest tonight, Jacob Kalensky.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the viewers for watching. And there are drinks at the bar, so please, I think you can also talk with our speakers there if you have any questions, a third, fourth, or fifth question. It's all possible at the bar, so please go there, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you. Bye.